Poor black girl marries 7-year-old man. 10 days later, she discovers his secret. Mira stood barefoot on the weathered floor of her grandmother's hut, the faint scent of dust mixing with the early morning air. The world outside was quiet, save for the hum of distant chatter. It was a world that had always been hers, but that morning everything changed. Her family had struggled for years in the small village nestled between the mountains, but the illness that struck Kofi, the one person she cared for the most, was the breaking point. With no money for treatment and no hope in sight, Myra's mother, Miriam, was forced into a painful decision. When Julian Thorne, a white man of 70 years, arrived from overseas, a glimmer of hope flickered in the otherwise desolate life they led. He came to the village with the reputation of an investor, though his true motives were far from ordinary. After seeing Mira in the market, Julian made his offer, a bride price so large that it could pay for Kofi's medical bills and secure a future for the family. With no other options, Myra's fate was sealed. Julian's presence in Myra's life felt like a strange dream. He treated her with a distance that was both protective and unnerving. Unlike the men of her village, he never demanded her obedience nor tried to force her into a role she didn't want. Instead, he gave her gifts, beautiful dresses, food, and a quiet place to sleep. But there was always something missing. For the first few days, Mira was unsure how to feel. His behavior didn't match the harsh reality she'd expected. There was kindness in his gestures, but also a lingering sadness in his eyes. He didn't talk much, nor did he touch her. It was as if he was waiting for something, a moment when his true intentions would finally be revealed. On the fourth night in their new home, Mira could no longer ignore the mystery surrounding Julian. She had overheard the whispers, the ones that spoke of strange places and unanswered questions about his past. When he left for town, Mira took a chance. She crept down the long hallway, her heart pounding as she approached the heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. Her hands shook as she found the lock. This room, so carefully guarded by Julian, had to hold answers. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper. The walls were lined with photographs, dozens of girls, all with different faces, different names, and different ages. But the connection between them was clear. Julian had been their protector, their guardian. Some had left him, others had disappeared, but none of them were forgotten. Mira felt a chill as she read the names beneath the photographs. Amara, Yara, Layla. Each girl had been a part of his silent mission to save those who had no other choice. Julian returned early that evening, finding Mira in the locked room. For a moment, he said nothing, only standing at the threshold, his gaze heavy with something unspoken. "I didn't want you to know this way." Julian's voice was soft but firm as he stepped into the room. "But you were always going to find out. It's who I am." Mira held her breath, clutching one of the letters she had found. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you marry me?" Julian took a deep breath, sitting down beside her. "Because you're going to be married off, just like all the others. There was no escape for you. Not from the village, not from a men who would have used you for their own gain." Myra's eyes widened. She had known something was wrong. But this truth, this revelation, hit her harder than anything she could have imagined. Julian's past was shrouded in mystery. A man who had traveled the world, offering protection to young girls in peril, yet leaving nothing behind but his silence and the faintest traces of his mission. He wasn't a hero, not by the world's standards. He was a man who had tried to do what he could in the quietest of ways to make things right. He told Mira about the girls he had found, orphans in the slums of China, abandoned children in the streets of Morocco, and others who had been caught in the grip of those who saw them as nothing more than commodities. He told her about the sacrifices he had made, the money he had spent, and the pain he had carried. He wasn't a savior. He was a man running out of time, trying to make up for a life that had never quite been his own. As she stood at the threshold of her new life, one that she never asked for, but one that had become her reality, Mira made a choice. She could stay and live in the world Julian had created for her, filled with the luxuries and comforts of a life she didn't earn. Or she could leave to seek a life of her own, one that was free from the shadows of the past. Julian died quietly in his sleep, his heart giving out from the years of hidden strain. In the wake of his death, Mira was left with the keys to his legacy, a legacy that was hers to carry. But more than that, she was left with the choice he had never been able to make for her. She chose to build, not in Julian's image, but in her own. She took the lessons of her past and made something of them, starting a foundation to help the girls who had once been forgotten. She built a network of women and men who understood what she had gone through, who could relate to her pain and her mission. And she created something that would last far beyond Julian's quiet life. Myra's journey was not easy. It was filled with doubts, fears, and the haunting echoes of a past she could never escape. But she knew now that the future was hers to create, and that with every step, she was breaking the cycle that had once held her captive. She had lived through the worst of it, but she had also lived through the best. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones we tell the world, but the ones we tell ourselves. And in the end, it was her own voice that mattered the most. Myra's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, the dim light from the hallway lamp casting shadows on the walls. She didn't sleep much anymore. The questions swirling in her mind refused to leave her, each one more pressing than the last. How had she gotten here? How had she gone from a simple village girl, yearning for escape, to a woman who was now caught in a web of mystery, wealth, and responsibility? The last few weeks had been a whirlwind. Julian's sudden death left a void, a silence that felt too big to fill. She still couldn't understand everything he had done, the lives he had touched, the choices he had made. Yet, in the midst of that silence, Mira felt a strange sense of purpose growing inside her, a sense of responsibility she had never known. The first time she stood before Julian's vast collection of letters, she had been overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The letters detailed the lives of girls he had helped, the ones he had saved, the ones who had been lost. They were written with a tenderness that belied the coldness of his exterior. Julian had been a man haunted by his own guilt, constantly questioning his choices, but always finding some reason to keep going. Mira ran her fingers over the yellowed pages. She could feel his presence in every word, in every sentence that described a life saved or a life lost. She had once thought Julian to be a stranger in her life, a man who had entered her world with a price and a plan. But now, she saw him as something more complex, a flawed, broken man who had tried to make a difference, even if he never could. As the weeks passed, Mira found herself drawn to the letters more and more. She couldn't stop reading them, couldn't stop trying to understand Julian's world. Each letter revealed something new, a struggle, a victory, a failure. There were pieces of a puzzle, and Mira was determined to put them together. But the more she read, the more she realized that the man who had saved her wasn't the man who had saved all those others. Julian's death had left so many questions unanswered, and it was up to Mira to find the answers. It was one evening, as she pored over yet another letter, that the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. The letter was dated just a few months before his death. It was addressed to a woman named Sia. Mira had heard the name before. Sia had been one of the girls who Julian had helped, a young woman from a small town in Ethiopia. But this letter was different from the others. In the letter, Julian confessed something that made Myra's heart race. He had once been in love with Sia. He had tried to protect her, to save her, but in the end, he had lost her. The guilt in his words was palpable, and Mira felt a pang of sadness for the man who had never allowed himself to heal from his past. Mira closed the letter and sat back, her mind racing. What had happened between Julian and Sia? And why had he never mentioned it to her? Never spoken to the woman who had clearly meant so much to him? Mira couldn't shake the feeling that Sia's story was crucial. She had to know more. The next day, Mira made a decision. She would find Sia. The journey to Ethiopia was long and exhausting, but Mira felt a sense of determination unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She had no idea what she would find when she reached Sia, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to understand the past, to piece together the story that Julian had left behind. When Mira arrived in the small village in Ethiopia, she felt the weight of her mission. She was no longer just a girl from a village in Africa. She was someone who carried the legacy of a man she barely understood. Julian's story had become her own, and she would carry it with her until she understood it fully. Sia's house was a modest one, tucked away on the outskirts of the village. When Mira arrived, she was greeted by a woman who seemed both strong and fragile. Sia's eyes were filled with the same sadness that Mira had seen in Julian's, and for a moment, Mira wondered if she had made a mistake by coming here. But as soon as Sia spoke, all doubts vanished. "You must be Mira," Sia said softly. "I knew you would come eventually. He always spoke of you." Myra's heart skipped a beat. "He did." Sia nodded. "Julian never stopped loving you. Even when he was lost in his own darkness, he always had you in his thoughts." The words hit Mira like a wave. She had never expected this. Julian, the man who had kept his distance, who had remained silent about his feelings for her, had loved her. But why hadn't he ever said anything? Why had he kept his emotions buried under layers of secrecy and guilt? "I don't understand," Mira said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't he tell me?" Sia's eyes softened. "Because he was afraid. Afraid that you would leave him. Afraid that you would see him as nothing more than the man who had ruined your life." Myra's heart ached. Julian had never given her the chance to see him as anything more than what he had presented himself to be: a man of duty, a man of action, a man with no room for love. But perhaps, deep down, he had been afraid that his own past would drive her away. Over the course of the next few days, Sia shared her story with Mira. She spoke of the time she spent with Julian, of the years they had spent together in secrecy. Their love had been intense, but it had never been enough to overcome the darkness that surrounded them both. Sia's voice broke as she spoke of the day she had left Julian, of the day she had walked away from everything she had ever known. "He asked me to stay, but I couldn't," Sia whispered. "I knew that he would never forgive himself for the things he had done, and I knew that I could never be the woman he needed." Mira listened in silence, feeling the weight of Sia's words. The pieces were coming together. Julian had loved her, but he had never been able to love himself. He had spent his life trying to make up for his mistakes, trying to heal the wounds that had festered inside him. Mira understood now. She understood why Julian had done what he had done. But it was too late. He was gone, and now it was up to her to finish the story. Mira sat alone in the small, quiet room that had been assigned to her at Sia's house. The warm sunlight filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on the worn wooden floor. Her thoughts swirled like a storm inside her mind, each one more overwhelming than the last. She had come here seeking answers, hoping to understand Julian's choices, his secrets, and why he had kept so much of his life hidden from her. But now, as she sat with the weight of the truth, she found herself feeling more lost than ever. Sia had opened up to her in a way that made Mira feel as though she was glimpsing a world she could never fully understand. Julian's past was a tangled mess of love, guilt, and pain, and Mira felt both sympathy and anger for the man who had played such a pivotal role in her life. But Sia's story wasn't the only thing that haunted Mira. As she sat there, her fingers tracing the edges of the letter that Julian had written to her, she realized that the answers she sought weren't just about Julian. They were about her, too. She had spent so much of her life feeling as though she were defined by the circumstances of her birth, by the village she came from, the people she had known, and the way the world saw her. But as she sat there, holding the letters and absorbing the weight of Julian's past, she wondered, was she still that girl? Or had she become something more? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her childhood friend, Ayo. "Are you okay? I heard about Julian. I know things were complicated, but I hope you're doing all right." Mira stared at the message for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. What could she say? How could she explain the emotional whirlwind she was trapped in? She typed a quick response. "I'm not sure I'm okay yet, Ayo, but I will be. I have to be." It was true. She had to be strong. For herself. For Julian's legacy. For the people he had saved. As the days passed, Myra's search for answers led her to more people who had known Julian. People from different parts of the world, each one with their own story to tell. She spoke to former colleagues, those who had worked with him on his various humanitarian projects. She met with activists, survivors, and strangers whose lives had been touched by his actions. Each conversation revealed a different layer of Julian's character. To some, he had been a savior, a man who had used his wealth and influence to make a real difference in the world. To others, he was a man burdened by his own demons, a man who could never fully escape the guilt that clung to him like a shadow. But through it all, Mira began to see a pattern that pointed to one undeniable truth. Julian had never truly understood how much his actions had mattered. He had always believed that he was inadequate, that he could never truly redeem himself for the mistakes of his past. And so, he had kept running, never allowing himself to be vulnerable, never allowing himself to truly love. But Mira was different. She had loved him from the moment their paths had crossed, even if he had never let her in. And now, she was determined to honor his memory by continuing the work he had started. One evening, after a particularly long day of interviews and research, Mira returned to see his house, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She was exhausted physically and emotionally. But when she entered the small room where she had been staying, something caught her eye, a letter sitting neatly on the desk. It was addressed to her. Mira's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Julian's. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the words, each one heavy with emotion. Mira, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to explain myself. I never expected you to understand me fully, but I hope that one day you would see the good I try to do. I hope you know that, in my heart, I never stopped loving you. You're stronger than you think. I've seen it in you from the first moment we met. You have a gift for seeing the truth, for understanding what others cannot. And now, the world needs you. There are things that still need to be done, things that I couldn't finish. I left a map for you. It's not a map to a treasure, but a map to the people whose lives we can still change. You're the one who can finish this journey. You're the one who can give them the future I promised. I'll always be with you in the choices you make, in the path you take. Take care of yourself, Mira. You're more than you know. Julian. Mira sat in stunned silence as she reread the letter, her hands shaking. Julian had known. He had known that she would be the one to carry his work forward. He had trusted her to finish what he had started, even though he had never given her the chance to truly understand what that meant. The responsibility that weighed on her now was heavier than anything she had ever felt. She couldn't just walk away from this. Not when Julian had entrusted her with so much. As the days turned into weeks, Mira began to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. She traveled to remote villages, meeting with those whose lives had been touched by Julian's work. She worked with organizations that he had supported, using the map he had left her to guide her every step of the way. But it wasn't just about the work. It was about the people. It was about seeing their faces light up when they realized that someone who cared, was there to help them. It was about restoring hope to those who had been forgotten. And as she continued Julian's work, Mira began to feel the pieces of herself fall into place. She was no longer the girl who had stumbled into Julian's life, unsure of her place in the world. She was someone who had found her purpose, someone who had the strength to face whatever came next. Julian's death had left a void in her life, but it had also opened a door to something new, something bigger than herself. She had the power to change the world, just as he had tried to. And with every step she took, she knew that Julian was watching over her, proud of the woman she had become. Mira's days were a blur of travel, meetings, and tireless efforts to piece together the fragmented world that Julian had left behind. The map he had left her, while a guiding light, was not a perfect blueprint. It was more like a series of cryptic messages hidden in plain sight. Every village she visited, every organization she partnered with, uncovered another piece of the puzzle, but nothing ever seemed to connect completely. There were whispers, too. People in the villages had started to speak of her as the one Julian trusted. But with those whispers came suspicion. Some questioned her legitimacy, doubting whether she was truly capable of following through with Julian's mission. Others were too afraid to even look her in the eye, their memories of Julian too painful to bear. Mira understood their hesitation. Julian had been a towering figure, one whose presence had filled rooms, whose ideas had sparked revolutions. He had promised things that were now, for many, mere fragments of hope. But Mira was determined to prove them wrong. She couldn't afford to doubt herself. There was no time for that. One evening, after returning from another fruitless trip to a remote village, Mira sat in the small, dimly lit room at Sia's house, staring at the map Julian had left her. The edges were frayed now from constant handling, but the markings were still legible. She had pored over it countless times, each time hoping that this would be the breakthrough. But nothing had come together the way she hoped. Her phone buzzed once again, this time a call from AO. She hesitated before answering, her exhaustion weighing heavily on her. "Hey." AO's voice came through, light but concerned. "How's it going over there?" "I'm not sure anymore," Mira admitted, rubbing her eyes. "I've been trying to put the pieces together, but something's off. I don't know if I'm missing something or if... I don't know. It's just harder than I thought." "You can do this, Mira. You have to keep going. I know you feel like you're running in circles, but you're not. Every step you take, even the ones that seem like setbacks, is still moving you forward. You're doing exactly what you're meant to." Mira felt a brief flicker of warmth at AO's words, but it was quickly replaced by the gnawing emptiness in her chest. She didn't know how to keep going. Every day felt like another mountain she had to climb alone, and she didn't know if she had the strength to reach the top. But she couldn't let her doubt win. The next morning, she decided to visit a small town that Julian had visited often during his missions. "Thanks, AO," she said softly. On the map. But she had heard enough stories from the locals to believe that this place was crucial to understanding Julian's final goals. It was a risk, but Myra had come to realize that sometimes the answers weren't where you expected them to be. The journey to the town took several days by bus, and as she arrived, the sun had already set. The town was quiet, almost eerily so. There were no bustling streets or crowds to greet her, just the soft hum of cicadas and the occasional flicker of lights from homes in the distance. Myra had heard rumors about the town's history, about its connection to Julian's earlier work, but nothing had prepared her for what she discovered. She spent the night in a modest guest house, and the next morning she set out to find the old woman who was said to have known Julian best. Her name was Mama Tola, and she lived in a small, humble house at the edge of town. When Myra arrived, Mama Tola was sitting outside, her weathered face lifted toward the sky, her hands resting on the cane beside her. "Are you here for him?" Mama Tola asked without turning her head, her voice rasping with age. Myra nodded, her throat tight. "I'm here for Julian. I need to understand what he left behind. The map he gave me, it's not enough. I don't know where to go from here." Mama Tola slowly turned her gaze toward Myra, her eyes sharp despite her age. "The map?" she murmured. "The map is only the beginning. Julian didn't leave it for you to follow step by step. He left it to make you think. You see, Julian was a man of action, not words. He believed in doing, not telling. That's why he made you his heir, because he knew you would figure it out." Myra swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "I'm not sure I can do this. I don't know if I'm ready." Mama Tola's lips curled into a faint smile. "No one is ever truly ready, child. But the world doesn't wait for readiness. It waits for those who are willing to take the leap. And from what I've seen, you are already halfway there." Myra took a deep breath, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But she couldn't back down now, not when the path was this close. "The town," Mama Tola continued, her voice becoming more serious, "has a story. A story that Julian never told you because he couldn't. But you need to hear it now. The answers you seek aren't on that map. They are in the hearts of the people who knew him, the people he loved, and the people he couldn't save." Myra listened intently as Mama Tola began to tell her the story of Julian's early days in the town, of his desperate attempts to help those trapped by poverty and violence. Julian had come here years ago, driven by a need to make a difference, but he had encountered forces too strong, too entrenched, to overcome. Despite all his efforts, the people he sought to help remained trapped, unable to escape this cycle of suffering. And then, just as quickly as he had come. Julian had left, disappearing from their lives. But his legacy had remained, woven into the very fabric of the town. The people here remembered him, his warmth, his compassion, and his inability to accept that some things were beyond his control. Myra realized, as Mama Tola spoke, that Julian hadn't failed. He had just been unable to finish what he had started. He hadn't given up on these people, but the world, it seemed, had given up on him. He had fought a battle that no one knew about, a battle with forces beyond his reach. But now, Myra understood that his mission wasn't just about helping people. It was about breaking cycles, about creating a world where the impossible could be possible. The next few days were a blur of meetings, uncovering hidden truths, and listening to stories from the townspeople who had once known Julian. With each conversation, Myra began to piece together the final part of Julian's legacy. It wasn't about reaching every person. It was about creating a ripple that would continue to spread long after he was gone. Myra had always believed that the world was full of impossible dreams. But now, she knew that the true legacy of a dreamer wasn't in achieving every dream. It was in inspiring others to continue dreaming, even when it seemed impossible. Myra's transformation into a true successor of Julian's mission becomes clearer as she unravels deeper layers of his past and connects with the people who had been part of his journey. She is no longer the girl unsure of her place, but a woman whose purpose is evolving in unexpected ways. The road ahead is still long and filled with challenges, but Myra knows now that she's not just following a path, she's creating one. She had not just inherited Julian's mission, she had become it. His struggles, his dreams, they had all become her own. And with every person she met, every village she visited, she began to see that what Julian had left behind wasn't just a mission. It was a legacy of resilience, of unyielding belief in the possibility of something better. Myra had faced countless obstacles, doubts, and moments when it seemed like giving up would be easier. She had questioned whether she was the right person for the task, whether she could ever truly follow in the footsteps of someone as great as Julian. But now, standing in the quiet calm of the evening, Myra realized that she didn't need to be like Julian to fulfill his mission. She simply needed to be herself, to believe in the power of small acts, of individual change, and to trust that the ripple effect of kindness, of effort, would reach farther than she could ever imagine. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from Io. "We did it, didn't we? You did it." Myra smiled softly, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had done it. They had done it. The pieces had finally come together, and while the work was never truly done, there was a sense of peace that settled in her heart. The journey had shaped her, had molded her into someone who now understood the weight of what it meant to carry a legacy. It was never just about the destination. It was about the people she met along the way, the lessons she learned, and the courage to continue when the path wasn't clear. She sent a simple reply to Io, "Yes, we did." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Myra felt a quiet sense of relief. Not the kind that comes from achieving a goal, but the kind that comes from knowing that she had done her best, that she had honored Julian's memory in the way it deserved to be honored. As she looked out over the town, the lights flickering in the distance like stars in the night, Myra realized that Julian's work would never truly end. It had simply passed into her hands, and now it was her turn to keep the flame burning. With a deep breath, Myra turned to face the future, knowing that while the road ahead would still be full of challenges, she was no longer walking it alone. She had carried Julian's hope, his belief, and his love forward, and in doing so, had created her own path. The world, despite all its chaos and uncertainty, still held the possibility of change. And Myra, more confident, more certain than ever, knew she was part of that change. She had found her purpose, and in that, there was a peace that came not from answers, but from knowing that the journey itself, though fraught with obstacles, was worth every step. Myra had done it, and in that moment, the world felt a little brighter, a little kinder, a little more hopeful. And as she walked away from the town, her heart light, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that she had finally begun to build the future Julian had always dreamed of. And with that, She knew the story was only just beginning.